Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on a topic I know a lot of you have been asking about. How technology is changing the very rules of economics.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It really is. And to guide our deep dive today, we have this article. It's called Technology Economics, Questioning Basic Principles of Economics. And let me tell you, it really lives up to that title.
It really does. It's a head spinner.
So to kick things off, the article jumps right in saying that technology is turning the idea of scarcity, like one of the most basic economic principles on its head.
Right.
So how does that even work? How can technology create abundance when we're constantly being told about limited resources and we've got to conserve this and conserve that?
Well, think about it this way. In the past, you had things like land, labor, those were scarce. And knowledge, that was a scarce resource.
Mm-hmm.
But technology has this power to multiply, in a way, certain resources and make them almost limitless.
Okay, so like music, for example. I can listen to practically any song ever recorded now instantly thanks to streaming and, all that kind of stuff. That's a far cry from having to track down a specific vinyl record.
Yeah, or you just think about the example they use in the article, ChatGPT. So suddenly you have access to information and expertise, things that used to be limited to, libraries or expensive consultants. That's widely available now.
It's like having a library, but in your pocket.
Exactly.
But that brings up kind of a scary question, I guess, for some people. What happens to jobs if technology can just kind of automate these knowledge-intensive tasks? Could a bot do your job someday?
You'd be surprised. But seriously, though, the article really dives into this complex relationship between technology and jobs. And one of the things it points out is that traditional economic models, they really struggle to predict how technology is going to impact the job market because it's not as simple as like a one-to-one replacement anymore.
Right. So it's not just robots taking over factory jobs like we kind of always pictured it.
Right. Technology is changing so fast now. It's changing what skills we need for the jobs we have, and it's creating jobs that we haven't even thought of yet. Remember when Japan emerged as this tech giant?
Right.
The article points out that was partly because what they call like the epicenter of innovation for key technologies, that shifted. And those shifts are happening constantly today, which makes it really hard to predict, what skills are we going to need in 5, 10, 20 years?
Yeah, for sure. So we've got abundance kind of missing with our idea of scarcity, technology reshaping the job market. What other kind of fundamental economic principles are being challenged here?
Well, remember economies of scale.
Right. So the more you make of something, the cheaper it is to produce each unit.
Exactly. And technology takes us to a whole new level, especially when you think about the digital world.
Because making one more copy of a self-help program, for example, that's practically free once you've built it.
Right. And as the article points out, this can lead to a huge concentration of power because you've got these tech giants like Google, Amazon. They can leverage these digital economies of scale in a way that traditional industries they never could.
Right. It's like comparing a corner store to this massive online marketplace. The scale is just completely different.
Exactly. And this ties into another big point the article makes about natural monopolies. We used to think of those as emerging in industries with high upfront costs like utilities.
Right.
But now you have these tech companies achieving dominance because of their networks, their data.
Right.
So there's a whole new category of natural monopolies, which raises questions about, are antitrust laws even equipped to deal with this? It's not just about, price fixing anymore.
Yeah, it's about who controls the whole system.
Yes.
Wow, this is already making my head spin. And this is just the beginning. But before we dive any deeper into the challenges and, maybe some of the opportunities that this new landscape presents, we've got to talk about what might be the most shocking claim in this entire article.
Okay, yeah.
And that's the idea that technology might actually be changing the relationship between inflation and unemployment.
Yeah, they're really going there.
That sounds like a really big deal. So how does that even work?
It's complicated,
Right.
but really interesting. So traditionally, we think if you pump a bunch of money into the economy, you risk inflation, right? There's more money, same amount of stuff.
Right.
But what this article is suggesting is that maybe, just maybe, technology allows us to increase productivity, increase output at a pace that can actually outstrip the inflationary effects of, increasing the money supply.
So are we saying we can just print our way out of economic problems now? Is that the takeaway here?
It's not quite that simple. The article really stresses that this is still a huge debate among economists. There's a lot of factors at play here. It's not a guaranteed outcome.
Mm.
But it does raise this really intriguing possibility that, maybe technology has changed the rules of the game when it comes to managing these really fundamental forces of inflation and employment.
Wow. Okay, so much to unpack there. This is making me think about all those DIY tech solutions that are out there. And the article actually talks about this, the power of what they call grassroots innovations. What do they mean by that?
Yeah, it's a cool concept.
Hmm.
So basically, they're talking about tech solutions that are coming from like communities, individuals, people who are trying to solve a very specific problem. They're not necessarily coming from like these big corporations or research labs. It's much more from the ground up.
So like that app I use to find my dog if he gets out. Somebody created that because they had that exact problem and now it helps thousands of pet owners.
Exactly. And these grassroots innovations, they often address things that like the big companies might not even be thinking about.
Hmm.
So the article really highlights the potential for these innovations to drive economic growth, especially in like developing countries, because you're empowering people to kind of find their own tech solutions to the problems that they're facing.
That makes a lot of sense. It seems like you would think any country with a lot of smart people who, want to innovate, they would just naturally become kind of an economic powerhouse. But I've noticed that's not always the case.
No, and I think that's a really important point. The article talks about this gap between invention and actual economic impact. Like, it's great to have ideas, but you need the right environment, you need infrastructure, investment, this whole ecosystem to actually help those ideas take root and grow into, successful businesses and industries.
It's like having a garden full of prize-winning tomatoes, but then, no way to actually get them to market, to sell them.
Perfect analogy. And that's what we need to be thinking about.
Mm.
How do we bridge that gap? How do we make sure that these grassroots innovations can actually reach their full potential?
Okay, so we've got technology shaking up the job market. We've got it kind of changing the balance of power in the market. But the article also touches on some of the potential downsides here. What are some of the challenges that come with all this tech-driven economic change?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest ones that the article raises is this potential for widening wealth inequality.
Mm.
Because, technology, it can create these amazing opportunities, but those benefits don't always reach everybody equally.
Right, it's like the gap between the haves and the have-nots. It could get even bigger if we're not careful.
Exactly. The companies that are best positioned to take advantage of these new technologies, they're the ones who are probably going to reap the biggest rewards. So the article really stresses that we need to be very intentional about how do we make sure that the benefits of all this progress are shared more broadly?
So it's not just about celebrating all the cool stuff that technology can do. It's about being mindful of the potential consequences as well.
Exactly. And that leads to, I think, another really important question that the article raises.
So how do we do that? How do we actually make sure that we're ready for all this change that's coming?
Well, the article uses this phrase, creative destruction, which sounds kind of intense.
It does, yeah.
But it basically means, as these new technologies come along, they're going to disrupt things. They're going to replace old industries, old ways of doing things. And that process can be really good. It leads to progress, but it can also be really, really disruptive.
Yeah, it's like that saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. But
Mhm.
in this case, we're not just talking about eggs. We're talking about people's livelihoods.
Exactly. And so the challenge that the article poses is how do we prepare for that? How do we become, as individuals and as a society, more resilient, more adaptable, when we know that this change is going to keep happening?
It's like we almost have to be comfortable with not knowing what's next, you know? Instead of trying to predict the future, it's more about just being ready for kind of anything.
Yeah, exactly. And the article really emphasizes this idea of lifelong learning. It's not enough to just learn one skill anymore. You've got to constantly be evolving, learning new things, being open to new ways of working.
So instead of being okay, I need to learn how to code in this very specific language, it's more about I need to be comfortable learning new languages, learning new technologies as they emerge.
Exactly. And it goes beyond individuals too, Governments, businesses, they have a huge role to play in this too. The article talks about creating this ecosystem where innovation is encouraged, where there are safety nets for people who are affected by these disruptions, job training, those kinds of things.
So how do we make sure everyone's got a surfboard and they know how to ride these ways of change instead of, getting wiped out?
I love that analogy. And it's not just about like, not drowning. It's about actually harnessing those waves,
Yeah.
using this incredible power of technology to actually create the kind of future that we want to see, a more abundant future, a more equitable future.
Well said. Well said. Wow, this deep dive has been a wild ride. I mean, we started with this like simple question, how's technology changing economics? And it's kind of blown up into this like mind-bending exploration of, abundance, disruption, progress.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen how technology is forcing us to rethink some of these like really deeply held beliefs about how the economy works.
Yeah, exactly. Like, are things really as scarce as we think they are? What does competition even look like in this new world?
Right. And then that big one, are inflation and unemployment really as connected as we always thought?
Right, right. So many big questions, but I think the biggest takeaway for me, and I hope for our listeners, is that, we can't just sit back and let technology kind of just happen to us. We all have a role to play in shaping how this all unfolds.
Couldn't agree more. It's not just about economics at the end of the day. It's about the kind of world that we're creating.
Well said. And on that note, that's a wrap on our deep dive into the world of technology and economics. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.